In the last segment on the Cold War, which is where we're at now, I had talked about the effects of the Second World War. Because there's a definitive link here, at least the way I understand the material that we're talking about. Namely, that the origins of the Cold War are really to be found in the last years of the Second World War. You may recall, of course, that the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain are allies, but there was always a level of mistrust during the Second World War. And that mistrust grows so that really by 1946, 1947, certainly by the late 1940s, you have, instead of just mistrust, you have a more overt or noticeable oppositional kind of relationship that has developed between Britain and the U.S. on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. And I think one good way to get at understanding the roots of this opposition would be to look at the meetings that occur late in World War II, from 1943 on, that involved the major leaders of these three nations, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And the first of these meetings occurs in November of 1943, and it occurs in Tehran, Iran, which is south of the Soviet Union. Roosevelt and Churchill will both travel to Tehran, and there they'll meet with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. And this is the first time that the three have all met together, sort of face to face. Now think of the timing for just a moment. It's November of 1943, and there's already been quite a bit of tension within the group. Churchill, sort of more overtly than Roosevelt, seems to suspect the Soviet Union, have this long-standing fear of communism. And he worries throughout the war, beyond just defeating Germany, he worries about the potential post-war threat of a strong Soviet Union, a strong communist presence in Europe, and what that will mean. Stalin's sort of aware of this. He's not going to be particularly trusting of his allies either. There's always this suspicion, and Stalin was sort of inherently suspicious, perhaps even, let's just go ahead and say it, paranoid, because he had to protect his own position of power. But what Stalin is really after, more than anything else, and this is what comes through at Tehran, is having his allies open up a second front in Europe. Now, again, remember, this is November of 43, so it's before D-Day. That's not going to come until the summer of 44. And Stalin has been pleading for some years now for the Allies to open that second front, primarily to relieve pressure on the Soviet military, which has been taking, huge losses. The United States and Britain, through shipping in particular, have been providing material for the war effort to the Soviet Union, but the losses have continued, so that Stalin, as he pushes back the Germans from the gates of Moscow, believes that only opening that second front in the West in Europe will really bring about an easing of the pressures on the Soviet military. If you recall from the World War II lecture that you've seen earlier, remember that the Germans in 1941 had launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union. Prior to that, Stalin had apparently counted upon an agreement with the Nazis, with the Germans. And of course, that was broken as they drove at really quite lightning speed, you might say, all the way to the gates of Moscow. By December of 1941, it looked really quite bleak for the Soviet Union. Gradually, the Soviets had fought their way back toward the West, pushing the Germans back, but it was expensive in terms of human life and material. Well, that's why that second front is so important. But there's a little bit more to it. Maybe rightly, Stalin had doubts that there were such logistical problems, problems with getting boats and all this for a landing on the European continent, that's what was forestalling an invasion. Stalin had thought, had pondered this question of whether or not the Allies, his allies, didn't see some advantage in sort of draining the strength of the Soviet Union, letting the Germans and the Soviets go at it and weakening one another simultaneously until it was safer for an Allied invasion of Europe. And an Allied invasion had been talked about. It was Winston Churchill who had suggested that the first invasion should take place really through Italy, through North Africa and through Italy. But that invasion had stalled, and Stalin, I think, had never believed that that was sufficient. And so what he was calling for in 1943 at Tehran was an actual invasion of Western Europe that would relieve the pressure. Roosevelt and Stalin ultimately agree to this invasion, that it will take place. And what that does, and I think this is worth noting, it means that while the Soviets are moving from east to west, which for you all, I guess, would be this way, it means that if a second front is opened in Europe, I hope my hand's not off the camera screen, but if a second front is open, that means that the Allies, the British, the French, the Canadians, etc., will be moving from west to east. And that almost assures or ensures that if the war is won, that these opposing forces, which are now allies, will ultimately meet across a sort of north-south line, that they'll come together at some point or points where their armies meet, and that will assure almost an east-west division at the end of the war of who controls what territory. And it may not seem like much, but it's sort of setting the stage, really, for some of the problems that we'll see after the Second World War's conclusion. In October of 1944, following the D-Day invasion, Winston Churchill made a special trip to meet individually with Joseph Stalin. Already worried, having gone through Tehran, already worried about the post-war dispensation of territory, who would control what, and wanting to ensure, in fact, that Britain could claim control over certain portions of Western Europe. In essence, and the story as this was done on a napkin at dinner, in essence dividing Europe, tacitly anyway, between what we call spheres of influence, areas where one particular group or nation enjoys the dominant influence. So that by 1944, Churchill and Stalin were both thinking in terms of dividing a post-war Europe, at least in terms of influence. The next major meeting will come at Yalta, in which all three of the leaders, the big three, are together. This comes in February of 1945, and Yalta is located in southern Russia, sort of along the Black Sea, in that area of southern Russia, or the southern Soviet Union, I suppose that would be better to say. By February of 1945, while the war continues, already it's fairly clear that Germany will only be able to continue the war for maybe months. The Battle of the Bulge has occurred. The sort of last German effort, which was somewhat unexpected apparently, has been beaten back. It's clear that Germany is being drained of its resources. The Soviets are moving on Germany. The Allies are moving on Germany. So it's kind of I hate to be too definite about it, but it's kind of a foregone conclusion that the Allies will be victorious. The Soviets then control much of Eastern Europe. And the Allies on the other side, the British and the US, Canadians, their forces, the French, Free French, are sort of pushing in from the west and control now most of France and are moving into Germany. So Stalin comes to Yalta wanting to ensure that there is a sphere of influence set up for the Soviet Union. One argument is that Stalin, sort of thinking historically, has ample evidence, ample experience to make him wary of the possibility of a future invasion of the Soviet Union. And so what he wants to ensure would be friendly states blocking any direct path for an invasion of the Soviet Union through Eastern Europe or Central Europe. The other thing I think Stalin was thinking about here was resources. It's not just a matter of holding sort of strategic positions, but it's a matter of the resources that those positions might offer as the Soviet Union seeks to rebuild its strength after the Second World War and the vast devastation of the war. Franklin Roosevelt, by February of 1945, is already showing decided signs of illness. He has, for a variety of reasons, he was an inveterate smoker, among others. He has clearly in photographs of the meeting bags, deep bags under his eyes. His skin is showing a paleness, almost a pallidness. And, his heart is not well. He's clearly an ill man. And some arguments by historians and others have been that Roosevelt at Yalta was not at the height of his strength. He was not in a position to do really strenuous negotiating, and he gave a good bit away to Stalin at Yalta. I think that, that may be so. I don't doubt but what illness, much as, illness in Europe may have affected Woodrow Wilson and his negotiating ability, it may have affected Roosevelt at Yalta. But there were also some things that I think Roosevelt particularly wanted out of the Yalta meeting. Specifically, Roosevelt, too, had already begun thinking about the post-war world. But I think what he foresaw was the need for instruments of settling disputes and instruments of avoiding war that the United States simply hadn't participated in the 1920s following World War I. I think Roosevelt wanted to do what Wilson had failed to do. And with the United States emerging from this war as just a true world power, the strongest nation on earth because of the way the war had been fought and the U.S.'s part in it, I think he saw the capacity of the United States operating through an instrument like what would become the United Nations to actually be that center that could maintain peaceful relationships. Now, maybe he was idealistic and utopian, but I really believe that's sort of what he had in mind. I think another point that Roosevelt was very much thinking about at Yalta was that while the war with Germany seemed to be reaching a conclusion, the war with Japan was still ongoing. And Roosevelt expected that the actual endgame of the war, in which probably U.S. troops would invade the home islands of Japan, I think Roosevelt understood what that would mean, that it would mean probably huge numbers of American casualties. It would be very destructive. And he wanted the Soviet Union to assist in that Pacific War. The Soviets had by and large avoided outright conflict with the Japanese. In fact, by February of 1945 at Yalta, they still had not declared war on Japan. It turns out that Roosevelt pushes for the creation of this institution of which I was speaking. And what comes of this is an acknowledgement or agreement among the big three that after the war, or toward the end of the war, there would be created a body, a deliberative body, to help avoid another world war. And this will lead ultimately to the creation of the United Nations, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which met for the first time in San Francisco in April of 1945. Now, there were some other pieces to this puzzle. that are fairly important. At Yalta, the big three agreed that what would be acceptable for Germany would be unconditional surrender. In other words, there would be no negotiating, there would be no anything else, that the only thing they would accept from Germany would be unconditional surrender, no conditions. They also, in terms of planning the post-war, agreed that in the immediate aftermath of the war, Germany would be divided. What had been de facto division along that north-south line following Tehran, at Yalta becomes an agreement over division. Germany would be divided into sectors, and the major players would all have sectors of occupation, so that the United States, the British, and the French would control, sort of in a shared way, a cooperative way, would control a western portion of Germany, and the Soviet Union would control the eastern portion of Germany. They also went on to divide up the city of Berlin. And understand that as a city, Berlin, like many German cities having been bombed throughout the war, was just in tatters. I mean, it was in horrible shape. Nonetheless, they were going to actually divide Berlin so that the Soviets again would control the eastern section, and the British, the United States, and the French would control the western section of Berlin. Another topic of discussion at Yalta was Poland and a free Poland, and particularly Winston Churchill, because remember, Britain had gone to war with Germany when Poland was invaded. That had been the kind of straw that sent the British and the French to war with Germany back in 1939. Churchill in particular made a point that Poland would need to be free to make up its own mind, that it would be reestablished as a nation state. He owed that to the Free Polish forces that had fought alongside the British. And basically, Stalin agrees to this notion. Likewise, Stalin will agree to the idea that there should be in Eastern or Central Europe, there should be free and fair elections. But that those elections would have to be carried out under Stalin's approval, which is to say that the elections would be free and fair, but any government established in Central or Eastern Europe would need to be friendly toward the interests of the Soviet Union. And so that's kind of the agreement. That's kind of how the end game comes down. Free and fair elections, but any government elected must be friendly to the interests of the Soviet Union. That's how things stood throughout much of 1945. But in July of 1945, the big three would meet once again. By this point, understand, Germany has surrendered. And Franklin Roosevelt, has died. Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. Like I said, he was already showing illness by the spring of 45 in a big way. Perhaps not at his best at Yalta, but then he dies in April. And that brings to the presidency a really untried figure, and that's Harry Truman. Remember that Truman is basically a machine politician from Missouri. He's not performed badly in the Senate, but he's also not demonstrated any particular capacity for the presidency. It's not necessarily just Roosevelt's death, though that plays a part, but there's a clear difference between Yalta and Potsdam. Yalta, the big three are still pretty much working together. By the time you get to Potsdam in the summer, in July of 1945, it's fairly clear that the tensions are on the rise. And so it's really here, I think, you begin to see the inklings of opposition, the inklings of conflicting interest. By this point, by the time you get to Potsdam, both sides had committed certain acts that led to distrust, or heightened the level of distrust for both sides. One of the things, for instance, that the Soviets complained about bitterly was that the United States had begun to restrict aid to the Soviets now that Germany was defeated, and that the United States was dawdling about providing post-war reconstruction aid to the Soviet Union. This reinforced the sense the Soviets had that the Allies, the US and Britain in particular, wanted to maintain a weakened Soviet Union. Something that Stalin, with his sense of nationalism, was always a problem, always a threat. But the Soviets had been busy too. By February of 1945, by the time we get to Yalta, and those free elections had really picked up, it became apparent to the Allies, Britain and the US in particular again, that these free and fair elections were being unduly influenced by the Soviet Union. By the time you get to Potsdam, the Soviets had already installed friendly governments in Romania. They were working through forces within various countries in Central and Eastern Europe to ensure these friendly governments would come to power. There were instances where communists actively worked to bring down coalition governments. And I think one of the most troubling points, certainly for the British, was Poland. By March, there was a restored Polish government, restored Polish sovereignty, but clearly it was the Soviet Union that would influence what happened with Poland, with a renewed Poland. There's also the issue then of what to do with the Japanese. One point at which the Big Three did agree was the so-called Potsdam Declaration. This declaration called for the utter destruction of Japan unless the Japanese surrendered. That surrender was to be effectively unconditional. It wasn't going to be negotiated. And they had to reach an agreement on occupation, which ultimately they do. The occupation would continue of Japan until such time as a new government acceptable to all parties could be installed. With this Potsdam Declaration, effectively the Soviets are agreeing to go to war with Japan, that they will participate in this process of destruction and surrender. Similarly, they talk about, at Potsdam, war crime trials, how opponents would be tried and dealt with after the war for acts committed during the war. Something that, in the end, I think the US and Britain favored far more than did the Soviet Union. But at the end here, I think it's worth considering the degree to which personalities played a role. Personalities and events. I've mentioned some of the events already. I've mentioned that Harry Truman takes the place of Franklin Roosevelt, and I've talked some in the past about Roosevelt's personality, his capacity to win over a crowd. Roosevelt certainly seemed to believe that he had, through his charm, a capacity of dealing with Joseph Stalin. And it was often the case that when someone felt left out, it was Churchill, Winston Churchill, because he felt like Roosevelt was spending too much time courting Stalin, wooing Stalin. It's sort of like a love triangle in a way. One party feels left out because the party of interest is spending too much time with the opposition. Well, Roosevelt was courting Stalin. He believed he had Churchill, so he's not going to spend time with Churchill and British interests as much as at these meetings he's going to spend time with Stalin. And I think Stalin encouraged that. He wanted to divide and conquer Roosevelt and Churchill. But at Potsdam, remember, Roosevelt's gone. Truman doesn't have experience on the international stage. Truman doesn't have experience with high-level negotiation. And then something quite incredible happens. The British public, following the Second World War, really on the heels of German defeat, determines that their wartime leader, Winston Churchill, won't be their peacetime leader. They choose to replace Churchill in elections. Clement Attlee comes to power. It is a huge blow to Winston Churchill, but it also then will impact what happens at Potsdam, as will some news. This news has to do with a test conducted out in New Mexico that basically gives the result that atomic weapons are possible. You know about the test, and we'll talk more about it in just a bit. But it's more or less in the midst of the Potsdam Conference that news arrives to Harry Truman that indeed the first test of the atomic bomb has been successful. And this has an effect on Truman. This is a massive weapon. It's a game changer, so to speak. It opens up the possibility that maybe the U.S. won't have to rely on the Soviet Union as much with Japan, and maybe it will give the U.S. a distinctive edge in the post-war in terms of military power. Truman, therefore, may very well have felt at Potsdam that he didn't have to bend over backwards for Joseph Stalin, that he didn't have to charm or negotiate, because he had this inveterate poker player, this card player. Harry Truman had that sort of ace up his sleeve. He had that unknown X factor that would give the United States a distinct advantage. Whatever the case, following the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, that sort of old group, the Churchill and Roosevelt, are out. And the tension and the mistrust over the very things we've talked about now has begun to bubble to the surface in a way it never had before. Potsdam, July 45, sets the tone. It's where we clearly see the origins of what will become an outright Cold War between the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, in the decades to come.